June 6, 1944, just after dawn, off the coast of Normandy, opposite the sector that Allied planners labeled Gold Beach. At first light, German armored officers inland believed the most dangerous phase of the invasion was already passing them by. The landings were clearly massive, but by doctrine and experience, naval gunfire was assumed to be a coastal threat. Warships could batter beaches, smash concrete, and churn sand into mud. But once tanks moved beyond the immediate shoreline, behind low ridges, through villages, or into orchards, they were expected to be relatively safe. This belief was not casual optimism. It was rooted in interwar assumptions shared across Europe. Naval guns were blunt instruments, inaccurate at long range, unsuited for mobile targets, and dependent on direct line of sight. That assumption collapsed within hours. By mid-morning, British battleships and cruisers offshore were no longer firing blindly at pre-planned beach targets. They were firing inland, often 10 to 15 miles beyond the waterline, guided by forward observers embedded with assault units or operating from exposed vantage points near the front. Warships such as HMS Warspite, HMS Ramillies, and HMS Rodney were not simply supporting the landings. They were functioning as mobile heavy artillery platforms, capable of delivering shells weighing more than 1,000 pounds onto coordinates transmitted by radio in near real time. German tank units attempting to maneuver toward the beaches quickly discovered that terrain offered little protection against such firepower. A 75-ton battleship shell did not need a direct hit to disable armor. The overpressure alone could flip lighter vehicles, rupture suspensions, or bury tanks beneath collapsing earth and masonry. Roads became death traps. Villages became funnels of destruction. Even well-dug hull-down positions could be neutralized when the surrounding ground was pulverized. British naval gunnery doctrine had been refined over years of wartime experience in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Fire control tables were precise. Spotting procedures were disciplined. Ships could adjust range and bearing within seconds, walking shells onto a target with methodical efficiency. What German officers perceived as random or lucky hits were, in reality, the outcome of industrialized precision, steel, mathematics, and communications working together at scale. By late morning, reports filtered back through German command channels describing tanks knocked out far from the beaches, with no visible enemy artillery nearby. The source of the fire was unclear. The effects, however, were undeniable. Armored counterattacks slowed, then stalled, not because British tanks had engaged them directly, but because the sea itself had reached inland. What made it lethal was not only the size of the shells, but the system that delivered them. British naval gunfire in 1944 was not an improvised beach bombardment. It was a practiced, layered method of targeting that treated the sea as an extension of the artillery park. Each major ship carried a gunnery organization built for precision. Stabilized directors, rangefinders, plotting rooms, and crews trained to turn map data into firing solutions. But the decisive link was ashore. Naval gunfire liaison teams moved in with the assault forces, often operating under the same dangers as infantry observers. Their job was brutally simple. Identify a target, translate its position into a grid reference, and keep a warship's fire walking toward it until the problem stopped moving. In the early hours, many missions were still fixed and predictable: coastal batteries, strong points, road exits. As the British and Canadians pushed off Gold and Juno, the requests changed. Now the targets were junctions where German armor might assemble, villages that formed natural choke points, and ridgelines that screened movement toward the beachhead. Tanks and half-tracks do not need to be visible from the sea to be vulnerable to naval fire. They only need to be where the map says they are, long enough for the corrections to tighten. This is where German assumptions failed. Armored officers expected to fight a battle of line of sight. One gun, one target, one duel. Naval gunfire was the opposite. It was area domination delivered at distance. A cruiser salvo could smash a crossroads and crater the approaches so deeply that a column could not pass without bunching up. A battleship's heavy shells could collapse stone buildings into the streets, turning a village into a trap. Even when armor survived intact, the terrain around it could be wrecked so thoroughly that it was immobilized, isolated, and then finished by other means. The psychological effect mattered too. Tank crews are trained to endure incoming fire, but most armor doctrine assumes you can locate the threat. Offshore naval guns erased that comfort. The first warning could be a rising whistle that seemed to come from the sky itself, followed by a shock wave that made engine blocks shudder and radio headsets crackle. When crews could not see the muzzle flash or the gun line, they could not judge whether to reverse, advance, or disperse. Uncertainty becomes paralysis, and paralysis on a crowded Norman road becomes a target. By noon, the British beachhead was not merely defended by what stood on the sand. It was defended by a moving ring of heavy guns at sea, reaching inland to hit the places German tanks needed most. Routes, assembly areas, and the few pieces of ground that made maneuver possible. In the British sector, the first great test came not on the sand, but on the inland approaches around Cannes and the Orne bridges. German planners understood that if armored forces could break through early, before the beachhead thickened into a defended zone, they might split the lodgements and drive a wedge to the sea. The only German armored division positioned close enough to strike on the first day was the 21st Panzer Division, and its movements became the kind of target naval gunfire was built to punish. Columns funneling along roads, pausing at junctions, compressing into villages, then trying to surge forward in bursts. From offshore, British battleships and cruisers acted like a heavy artillery regiment that could shift its battery position without ever touching the ground. When forward observers reported armor assembling or pushing through key routes, ships could be ordered onto fresh targets in minutes. The earliest missions that morning still focused on known coastal batteries such as those around Bennerville and Villerville, because those guns threatened the landing craft and the fragile supply flow behind the first waves. But as the day developed, naval fire began to reach toward the deeper problem: German attempts to gather strength for counterattack. This is the part of the story that sounds exaggerated until you consider the physics. A tank is designed to survive a direct, localized impact from an anti-tank gun. It is not designed to survive the environment created by a heavy naval shell exploding nearby. Battleship-caliber fire could collapse buildings onto vehicles, snap tracks with flying masonry, crater roads so deeply that recovery vehicles could not reach the disabled, and shred the cohesion of a column without needing a clean tank kill in the classic sense. Armor that cannot move is armor that will be isolated, and isolated armor is eventually destroyed by air attack, anti-tank guns, or infantry with close-range weapons. German officers later described an unnerving pattern. The fire did not feel random. It arrived where the road narrowed, where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the map gave only a few practical options. That was not luck. It was the logic of a battlefield seen through grid references and corrected bursts: observation, transmission, adjustment, effect. In that system, every pause became dangerous, and every predictable route became a liability. By the afternoon of the first day, the beaches were no longer the edge of Allied power. They were the anchor point. The reach extended inland, and the German counterattack problem was no longer simply, can we get the tanks there? It was, can we even move them without the sea finding the road? By the end of D-Day, the British beachhead was still shallow, and the German armored threat had not vanished. It simply changed shape. Instead of a single dramatic thrust straight into the surf, German formations began probing for seams, trying to reach the road network that fed the landing areas, or to concentrate behind hedgerows and villages where they could launch piecemeal attacks without presenting a neat target. That is where the offshore guns stayed relevant long after the first waves were ashore. HMS Warspite had opened fire early that morning against the German battery at Villerville, using her 15-inch guns from well offshore, then continued bombardment tasks into the following days as the fighting pushed inland. And HMS Rodney, once brought forward into the Normandy gunfire role, would fire not only at coastal defenses but at inland targets linked to the struggle around Cannes, including bombardments during major operations later in June and early July. The important point is not that a battleship could hunt tanks the way a fighter bomber might. Could not. Tanks were too small, too quick, and too often hidden. The point is that German armor does not function as isolated machines. It functions as movement, columns, junctions, bridges, assembly areas, and the narrow lanes that force vehicles to slow and bunch. Naval gunfire did not need perfect visibility of a Panther's turret. It needed the predictable geography of Normandy. Forward observers and shore fire control teams translated that geography into coordinates. They were the bridge between a warship's gunnery system and a ground commander's urgent problem. Armor gathering behind a ridge, half-tracks stacking at a road exit, a village turning into a hard point, a bridge that had to be denied for just long enough. The United States Navy's own historical summary of Normandy naval gunfire emphasizes how shore fire control parties were integral to linking ships to troops ashore, even while noting the organizational difficulty of moving and preparing those teams. To German crews, the experience could feel less like being shot at and more like having the map itself turn hostile. A road that looked safe at dawn could be cratered by noon. A stone village that offered cover could become a collapse zone. A bridge that promised speed could become a reference point for destruction. Once that happens, armored counterattack stops being a matter of bravery or training. It becomes a matter of time, congestion, and whether there is any route left that does not run through the crosshairs of ships you cannot see. And as the Normandy battle tightened around Cannes, those unseen guns remained part of the equation. The longer the fighting moved inland, the more the story became one of communication rather than caliber. A warship could carry guns that dwarfed anything on land, but without eyes and radios ashore, it was simply throwing weight at the horizon. The reason German armor kept feeling the sea's reach was that the Allies had built the connective tissue to aim it. Shore fire control parties and naval gunfire liaison teams were attached to assault formations with one purpose: to make a ship's gunnery behave like responsive artillery. They carried maps marked to the same grid system used by the troops, radios netted to specific fire support ships, and a disciplined method for corrections. The process was deliberately unromantic. A target was identified. A grid reference was sent. The ship fired. The observer watched the fall of shot and corrected it. Salvos walked in measured steps until the aim point was buried under controlled bursts. When German units moved, the fire did not chase them like a fighter pilot. It punished the points where movement had to slow, concentrate, or turn: bridges, junctions, village streets, and the shallow valleys that funneled armor into predictable lanes. That is why, even when a tank survived, the counterattack could still fail. An armored formation is not just tanks. It is fuel trucks, ammunition, recovery vehicles, signal units, engineers, and the road discipline that keeps a column coherent under pressure. Heavy naval shells did not need to pierce frontal armor to shatter that structure. One crater in the wrong place could lock vehicles in a queue. One demolished building could block a village street and force a detour into open ground. One smashed bridge approach could strand a mixed group of tanks and half-tracks on the wrong side of the fight, waiting while the rest of the plan dissolved. For German commanders, this created a cruel contrast. Armor doctrine promised tempo: concentrate, strike, exploit. Naval gunfire robbed them of tempo before contact. It also robbed them of certainty. When a unit cannot identify the gun line, it cannot choose the correct response. It hesitates, bunches, reroutes, and radios higher headquarters for permission, and every minute spent doing that is another minute in which the map remains predictable enough for observers to feed coordinates into the sea. By the time the Normandy battle turned into a grinding contest around Cannes, the offshore guns had become part of the Allied method. Not a spectacle for the beaches, but a heavy, disciplined pressure applied against the very mechanics of German armored movement. In the end, the most important lesson was not that a battleship could destroy a tank, but that Britain and her allies had turned naval gunfire into an extension of land warfare, aimed by trained observers and sustained by planning, discipline, and production. German armor entered Normandy believing the decisive fight would be fought by tanks against tanks, at visible ranges, governed by the familiar rules of cover and line of sight. Instead, the decisive pressure was often applied before the duel ever began, against the roads and junctions that made maneuver possible, and against the fragile rhythm of an armored counterattack. Naval gunfire did not win Normandy alone. It could not hold ground, clear hedgerows, or search every orchard for a camouflaged vehicle. But it did something equally strategic in the opening weeks. It bought time. It blunted early counterattacks, disrupted concentrations, and helped prevent a shallow beachhead from being rolled back before Allied strength ashore became irreversible. When German tanks were forced to halt, detour, or wait for darkness, the invasion timetable swung further in the Allies' favor. And once that happened, the battle became what Germany could least afford in 1944. A contest of attrition against an enemy whose firepower was not just at the front, but offshore, mobile, and reinforced by an industrial base that could keep feeding the guns. That is why so many German armored moves in Normandy felt as if they were being shattered beyond the beaches. They were not only meeting the British Army, they were meeting the combined weight of sea power, communications, and controlled fire, reaching inland to break the mechanics of attack. If this breakdown of British naval gunfire helped you see Normandy in a new way, tell me in the comments. Which warship or gunfire mission do you think had the greatest impact on the land battle? And if you want more factual, documentary-style World War II stories like this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications.